This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagan. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right, where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals. And if you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives, with the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. So I'm here with Professors Chris Karpowitz and Kelly Patterson of Brigham Young University. We are going to talk about their article and their article on moral individualism, for which there is an upcoming book that I believe will be released sometime in the early summer. Professor Karpowitz, or Chris, is joining us from Provo, and Professor Patterson, Kelly, is joining us from Paris. So welcome, gentlemen.
Yeah, it's not Paris, Idaho either.
It's not Paris, Idaho. It's
Paris, France.
Or Paris, Texas. We got a lot of Parises in the U.S. We got more than France does.
The Hotel de Ville had an actual exhibit one time of all the Parises in the United States.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Do you happen to know how many there were?
There were at least 7 or 8, but it was a lot.
Funny. That is funny. Okay, so yeah, that's if you have like one shot to name a town, I feel like you give it your own brand. You don't just pick your city. I mean, my mother would.
It's going to be hard to reach the standard of Paris, France.
So. Yeah, I mean, my mother was born in Rome, Georgia, so this is kind of an issue that hits close to home. But okay, so let's start from the start. Okay, what is moral individualism, as you define it?
Chris, go ahead.
Well, moral individualism, there are lots of different measures of individualism, lots of different approaches to individualism. In political science, for example, the tendency is to focus on economic individualism, a sense of support for a certain approach to economic relationships and exchanges. But what we're interested in is the extent to which people feel independent of other institutions or influences that might constrain or shape their moral judgments.
Okay.
And so that's why we call it moral individualism. It's a focus on what we call self-authorization for moral choices. And we see this general sentiment around us all the time in all kinds of settings. This notion that people ought not to look to any other influences or forces outside themselves, that they themselves are fundamentally the only primary and in some cases only author of any kind of moral constraints or judgments that they need to make. And so we're interested in that, in part because it's been an important aspect of how political philosophers have thought about individualism over the years. And we're interested in what the political effects of those beliefs are, or at least the political correlates of those beliefs.
Yeah, Chris is right. It oftentimes in popular culture and definitely in the academic literature, individualism is thought about in terms of economic relationships, self-sufficiency, being able to keep what you earn, those sorts of things. And
Yeah.
then sociologists often refer to individualism as sort of a way of relating to groups,
Yeah.
and the relationship between the individual and the group, and how much emphasis is given to the goals of a particular group. And then we call our measure moral individualism, not because we're arguing that individualism is necessarily moral, but because
Right.
it has to do with this idea that Chris was talking about of autonomy, which is how
Hmm.
political theorists often refer to it. Uh, you know, some agency that allows a person to ground moral decisions in what the self wants as opposed to what any entity external to the self may want.
Okay, so just to pick up one thing right there. So when Chris was talking about the relationship of the individual to institutions, and then when you're talking about how the sociologists look at it, you're talking about the relationship between individuals and groups. So is there is is that a distinction that you were thinking about when you went into your research? Like looking, I don't know if I'm asking the right question. It's just something that stood out. Because in the article, you talk in the influences you looked at as to where people could get their moral intuitions, moral judgments. You're looking at religions, you're looking at the government, you're looking at family and friends. um
Yeah, and it's not just about sort of where those moral intuitions come from.
yeah.
It's the argument that people will make to justify or legitimize those moral intuitions.
Interesting.
That's what I think is critical,
Yeah.
because then people are relying on they can either rely on institutions, they can rely on traditions, they can rely on sort of religious authority, they can rely
Hmm.
on science, but the source of that moral authority matters, because
Right.
different sources make different claims
Hmm.
for how solid and how epistemologically tight those
Hmm.
arguments are.
You did a great job making a good answer out of a bad question, so thank you for that. But taking a step back, where did this interest come from in the first place? How did you start to see the gap in the literature? Had you two been working together for a long time before you started looking into this?
We've been colleagues for a long time, and we teach a course together at BYU called American Heritage. That's
Mm,
an introduction to the American constitutional system, to some basic principles of economics, and to some key moments in American history. It's a required course for students here at BYU, and as we taught that course, it caused us to think about um, the question of moral judgment and
mhm,
how we make our moral judgments. And as we interact with students, and just as we observe the world generally, we saw this argument in favor of moral individualism increasing over time. So
yeah,
our students were more more attuned to this argument. They were more likely to make um, claims that rely on this notion of moral individualism, and again, this sort of emerged out of many hours of us talking together about what we're seeing in the world, and also realizing that political science didn't really have a good measure
mhm,
of this particular approach to the world, and so that caused us to start doing work. And we've been working on this for a long time. Before the pandemic, we
right.
really started in earnest on this, but then the pandemic provided us with a particularly stark example of the tension between individual autonomy and the claims of institutions.
And yeah, Chris is right. We've been talking about this and thinking about this for a long time, and trying to come to grips with the way to measure it. The
Mhm.
the idea of a sort of this framework for thinking about individualism actually has its roots in, if you want to call it that, in kind of the American experience.
Yeah.
Like Tocqueville,
Yeah.
he sort of saw that there was something different about America, and it was the French who first coined the term for individualism as something that was very different from what was developing in Europe and elsewhere. And then we have a tradition of like Whitman and Thoreau and Emerson who have kind of taken the idea of the individual and expounded upon it and enlarged it. And then you see in historians talk about it this way as, sort of a movement in America from worshiping God to worshiping the nation to worshiping the individual. That's the
Mhm.
historian Andrew Delbanco. And of course, political scientists, political theorists like Michael Sandel and other political theorists have done the same thing and sort of traced this development of individualism in this kind of like moral judgment
Mhm.
sort of a way on the way in which the country functions.
Yeah.
And so Chris and I, we've been talking about this, and then we thought, well, this isn't what we see in the literature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When people talk about individualism, measures of individualism as an American value, always had uh, empirically sort of an economic cast, or in
Mhm.
sociology, it always had sort of like that relationship to the group cast. No real measure to our, in our kind of like investigations, really got at this principle of, well, how am I going to justify these moral intuitions?
Yeah. And so how how did you set up, like you're doing this through surveys. How did you set up a measurement where you can empirically measure moral individualism?
This is Chris.
Okay.
This is Chris's bread and butter.
Mhm.
Well, it was definitely a joint project here. We worked together on it. We started by just asking people open-ended questions about
Mhm.
when you make judgments about what's right and wrong. Um, who how do you make those judgments? Who are the influences or the people or the institutions that seem to matter for you? And so
Mhm.
we looked at a wide variety. We asked people to just tell us everything that they thought. Now, some people are not lots of people may not be able to actually articulate that very well. That
Right.
is, we all have there's motivation for our action that we don't fully recognize or are able to articulate. But in this case, we were just interested in people telling us, who are the important influences in your life
Mhm.
and as you make choices in your life. And so, um, out of those open-ended initial survey questions, then there's a series of things that seem to come up a lot. So some people talk about religion, some people talk about science,
Mhm.
others talk about family members or friends, teachers. And so when we measure this, we do it in two stages. The first thing we do is ask people from a curated list that came out of our initial open-ended investigations,
Mhm.
which influences are the most important for you
Mhm.
when you're making important decisions about what's right and wrong. And then we whatever they say to that initial question, we pipe into a series of additional questions where we ask them to tell us, is it okay to push back against that authority? Is it okay to make a judgment for yourself instead of listening to those authorities? And
Yeah.
so th- that's the way we developed this new measure that um, people hadn't been using before. And that's not to say that economic individualism isn't important too. It is. So
Mhm.
we're not arguing that we should get rid of those old measures. We're just arguing those measures are not capturing an important element of individualism. And so we then did a series of surveys over a number of years where we
Mhm.
asked those individualism questions, and then we looked at the relationship between answers to those questions and a number of other political and social variables.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes sense. And then you did see an impact with the pandemic because some
Right.
percentage of the surveys would these surveys were conducted before, and then they're conducted during, and then kind of at the tail end. If memory serves correctly, it was like the surveys were conducted over the period from 2018 to 2022, more or
Yeah,
less.
about that. That's
Okay.
right. And so yeah, so we have a series of measures and a series of we have a gigantic survey before the pandemic, and then during the pandemic, it was our view that the pandemic was a kind of crucible for people thinking about these kinds of issues. Should I
Mhm.
go along with what public health authorities are saying, or shouldn't I?
Mhm.
Now, I think in retrospect, we can see that public health authorities weren't always right,
Mhm.
right? So that, um,
How dare you?
yeah, they made mistakes too.
Yeah.
But we found during the pandemic, people were just much less willing. People who scored high on our measure of moral individualism were just much less willing to sacrifice their individual interests on behalf of the public good.
Mhm.
Um, and the pandemic is a unique experience where there is a collective threat, and our we have a collective action problem. That is,
Mhm.
we have to work together. This is the same is true of, say, vaccinations, right? For
Yeah.
vaccination to be effective, we actually have to decide together that this is something that we're going to do.
Mhm.
and and so the pandemic presented us with a set of choices about things we had to do. And so we asked people a number of different questions, some of them questions about their own behavior during the pandemic. We gave them some hypotheticals to think about, you know, if the local hospital needed more masks or something, would you be willing to give up yours and
Mhm.
to donate to the hospital? Other things like that. And we found over a host of different types of questions, the reaction was the same, and it was distinct um, for moral individualism as opposed to other kinds of individualism. For some measures, those indicators of individualism all kind of had similar associations. But
Mhm.
for a number of measures, moral individualism was unique. And in each case, we found that people who score high in moral individualism were just less likely to be willing to sacrifice on behalf of the public good, on behalf
Yeah.
of, and that was particularly notable for us because this isn't just a case of sort of differing perspectives about some political issue. This is a case where people's physical health was at stake, the
Mhm.
community's physical health was at stake.
Yeah.
And moral individualists were just way more committed to kind of doing their own thing and to not responding to what public health authorities were asking, or even just to sort of help each other,
Yeah.
look in on each other, help each other during key moments of the pandemic.
So there's a seeming paradox in the article and in the research, and let me know if I have this right. But you found that people that scored high on moral individualism were, less likely to get vaccinated, less likely to, wear a mask, that sort of stuff. That makes sense. And you
Mhm.
can see how that wouldn't necessarily just be moral individualism. Maybe people are skeptical for whatever reason of the public health establishment. They're skeptical of the government's narrative, whatever it might be at the time. Okay, but then those people who are in theory taking COVID less seriously were also less likely to be willing to part with their own masks and supplies and give them to other members of the community. Do I have
Yeah,
that
that's
right?
right. That's right. So
That's
so
fascinating.
yeah, they were just, less likely to want to help out, other people across a host of different indicators, and those results hold up even when we control for lots of other things that we know are related to pandemic activity. So we
Yeah.
know that partisanship matters and support for
Mhm.
Donald Trump matters, and we also know that on the other end of the spectrum, a kind of general sense of pro-sociality matters. Even when we
Right.
control for all of that, beliefs about moral individualism still endure and are strongly associated with people's behavior during the pandemic, people's attitudes about the pandemic, their behavior during the pandemic, their willingness to sacrifice on behalf of others, their willingness even to do simple things like look in on their neighbors to make sure they're okay, or reach out to their
Yeah.
neighbors in some way. They just were less willing to do those things.
That's really interesting. So two questions kind of jump out of that. And I understand, one of the great tragedies of this is that the data is so interesting, but you only came up with the measurement, recently, and so you only have that empirical data for this period of 2018, 2022, and it would be so interesting to have it going back
Oh yeah.
generations. And I I am not a political scientist, but I assume that would be difficult to reverse engineer and just pull out of thin air. Is that right?
Or maybe this excellent podcast will reach
Yeah.
toward reach out and make contact with the foundation that is willing to subsidize
Yes.
the
That's
study
yes.
for years going forward, so that because at least we would have had a nice baseline.
Right. Right. So, a couple of questions came out of that for me. One, I'd really be interested in your thoughts. I imagine you actually have this in the data, or might have it in the data. But how does moral individualism map onto our current political dynamic? How the parties are, kind of sequestered themselves right now, and then also, given the lack of empirical data, or despite the lack of empirical data, do you have any theories about how moral individualism has changed over time? About whether there would be fewer people that rate highly on the scale, 20 or 40 or 60 years ago, how that's changed.
I'll take the second part of that
Yeah.
question, Chris, if you don't mind. The it's hard to tell. Once again, we don't have estimates
Hmm.
going back that far, but our suspicions would be sort of an increase
Yeah.
in in the proportion, and maybe even in the strength of it,
Hmm.
simply because we're going through a period of time now in American history and politics in which the influence of institutions, scientific institutions, religious institutions, educational institutions, have waned,
Hmm.
and and there haven't there hasn't been a, a set of institutions that have arisen to take their places. And because of that, I think what you have is a great deal more of a culture in which people are more comfortable saying that what I think is right and it's my choice, therefore it's true,
Yeah.
than you would have had even 30, 40, 50 years ago. Uh, Clearly, some of these trends toward the undermining of institutions began a while ago.
Yeah.
That those who study the '60s and lived through them will
Right.
understand what the impact of that sort of constant critique of institutions did to various uh, entities within our civic culture.
Hmm.
So I think it's probably increased, and I'd say the potency of it has strengthened as well, to the point where it's just reinforced in our popular culture. It's hard to get away from advertising that just simply says, you do you. This is for you. This is about you. You deserve this. There's nobody who can deny you this. There's so it reinforces that message in a commercial way, but it's
Yeah.
still there, to the point where even at a school like Brigham Young University, where our students come in with a set of deep commitments
Sure.
to religious values and an institution, will even sort of parrot back those arguments to us sometimes.
Yeah, I mean,
Interesting.
we live in an age in which trust in institutions has been declining and is
Yeah.
very low right now. And I think Kelly is exactly right. You see this all around you. One of the things we do in our book is look at the differing slogans that the Army has used, right? Over time. So
Uh-huh.
this is a brilliant insight from Kelly, where if you look back in the in the 70s and early 80s, the Army slogan was "Join the people who joined the Army." Right, which is indicating a kind of collective
Yeah.
activity and a kind of collective effort. And then it was "Be all you can be."
Yeah.
Um, and then it was an army of one. Uh, like, what is that supposed to mean, actually? And today, the most recent slogan that we found is "What's your warrior?" Right, which is all
Yeah.
about sort of your inner state. And I'm not
Yeah.
saying that that's unimportant, or
Right.
that um, those kinds of sentiments aren't powerful and meaningful. It's just that when you're recruiting for the Army, which is the ultimate sort of collective endeavor that's
Yeah.
dedicated to the needs of the community and defending the community, it's the recruiting appeal is on the basis of individualism. And that is striking to us.
That
Um,
is striking. I because I wonder, I like that's an affirmative choice by the decision makers at the Army to do
yeah,
that. It's like, what are they responding to?
They're responding
yeah,
to those changes in popular culture.
Yeah,
yeah.
man.
In terms of the first part of your question about how does
Yeah.
this map on to our political situation today or the political parties today, the unique thing that we found um, is that you can find moral individualists all across the political spectrum. They're in both political parties. It's not strongly correlated with partisanship. Um, there's this claim of individualism, sort of on both sides of the aisle. Now, Republicans and Democrats differ quite
Yeah.
a bit in what kinds of institutions they care the most about, right? So Republicans are more likely to say they care about religion,
Mhm.
and Democrats are more likely to say they care about science as an important institution. But once we control for that, in terms of their willingness to push back against those institutions, we find they're similar on both sides of the aisle. And this has, I think, some important effects, right? Some
Yeah.
um, important uh, consequences for our culture, right? So what outside of the pandemic, we look at people's commitment to things like marriage and family,
Yeah.
or the most political thing we looked at outside the pandemic was views about January 6th. And it turns out that moral individualists were just way more likely to be okay with January 6th, to feel like, yeah, that particular attack on our institutions was justified.
Mhm.
And so, again, I think it speaks to a kind of widespread undermining or willingness to uh, or worry about existing institutions and the kinds of of things that institutions do. So,
Yeah.
and I just think we see that all around us, and we see it on
Yeah.
both sides of the aisle.
And
Yeah.
and our political culture, as your writings and discussions have pointed out, our our political culture is difficult right now. It's fraught in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
And one possible remedy to that people have lit upon is this idea of appeals to kindness and to dignity, and which we agree with.
Mhm.
But we shouldn't underestimate how hard it is to get people to be kind and to recognize the dignity of somebody else if the argument that comes back at you is why.
Yeah.
Why do I need to do that? Well, because your religion asks you to do it. Well, I don't care about what my religion asks me to
Yeah.
do. Or because it's science or social science shows that that's how uh, flourishing societies operate.
Mhm.
And someone says, I don't care.
I've got to
Yeah.
do me,
If,
that's
if, if it goes against what I'm saying,
Yeah.
then it's hard to come up with a response that a person would find cogent and compelling.
Yeah. That's really interesting because obviously, like what you point out right there, obviously, I think about this a lot. I think about it at a ton, trying to communicate to uh, both, the right and the left to, help them understand that the people on the other side are not, they're not insane. They're not stupid. They might have views that based on certain subsets of the facts look that way, but they probably aren't that way. And then regardless, treating them as such is not a good way to change their behavior. And
yeah.
I and that's kind of where I get to I think the version of my argument that has been more compelling to people is that the way that we approach our modern politics is profoundly uh, ineffective. Where the other side is cast as the enemy, because if you assume that the goal is to persuade more people to leave their current team or change their current way of thinking and join your team, or adopt your way of thinking, or at least understand it, then basically you should adapt your behavior to that end. And the really oppositional behaviors are not well suited to that end, and they in fact exacerbate the problem. And so, whatever you think of your opponents, it makes more sense to treat them with kindness, or whatever, or at least earnestly seek to understand where they're coming from, make them comfortable, open that dialogue up, and then you can start to argue. And ideally, your arguments will be much more well suited to what their actual concerns are, and you
And
end up,
I think
yeah.
that's so important. And one of the challenges that we see associated with moral individualism is that it undermines the structures through which we can engage each other in
Yeah.
productive ways. Kelly and I teach this course on the Constitution, and one of the things that we try to emphasize is that the Constitution is a set of structures, of institutions for bringing people who have very different life experiences, very different perspectives, very different interests together, and
Yeah.
helping them to find something that they might have in common and to move forward together. But if your attitude is, well, well, let's just burn down the institutions, right? They don't matter. I don't need to have respect for those institutions. Again, this is not to say that institutions don't have problems or can't be problematic
Right.
or even oppressive,
Right.
right? But if your sort of knee-jerk reaction is, I just want to burn them down,
Mhm.
then you've lost the structure that allows those interactions to take place in a meaningful way,
Yeah.
at least on the elite level. But
Yeah.
I would suggest more broadly in the United States as well.
I think that's exactly right. So the article is, including the notes, everything, 28 pages long. I'd imagine the book is going to be a little bit longer.
It is.
So
It's a bit longer.
what is
That's why you wrote a book.
yeah, what is in the book that isn't in the article?
Well, the article focuses mostly on the pandemic. So the article sort of
Okay.
does two things. For political scientists, it tries to um, make a case for this particular measure,
Yeah.
which is important, right? We're trying to introduce that to the discipline, but it's then showing how that measure matters in the context of the pandemic. And in the book, I think we do a number of other things. One, we can develop the theory behind this to a much greater extent and in a much richer way. Two, we can still explore the pandemic, and there's a chapter that does that. But three, we can also then expand beyond the pandemic to explore a whole variety of other things that we didn't have time to do in in the article, or didn't have space to do in the article. And so
Hmm.
we look at other things like people's relationship to religious institutions, their relationship to family institutions, their relationship to um, ideas and values like the American dream. What does the
Yeah.
American dream mean to people who are moral individualists as opposed to people who score at the lower end of that scale? We look at friendship relationships, and we look at sort of more broadly patterns of political participation and volunteering um, in communities and in the nation. And so
Hmm.
the book just gives us a little more freedom and flexibility to explore explore more and a wider variety uh, of things, and also in greater depth.
And it
Yeah.
looks at political outcomes. So
Okay.
some different attitudes toward politics as well. So Chris rightfully points out how important it is to these various social relationships that we have. And one of the areas that we also look at is political participation, likelihood of voting,
Hmm.
attitudes toward January 6th, and the like.
Hmm.
And what we find is that, as you might expect, when you have these ties from institutions that have loosened, and along
Hmm.
with that, sort of the norms that kind of make institutions work, then you have fewer sort of behaviors or reported behaviors that we have often attributed or associated with healthy democracies.
Yeah.
And I think that's our core. That's kind of the core ending point for us, which is not that moral individualism doesn't have a place, or
Hmm.
that this notion of autonomy is wholly negative, right? There are some important ways in which um, recognizing the shortcomings of institutions and helping them to improve
Hmm.
um, can be very healthy,
Yeah.
and a kind of moral independence to call your institution to account when it's doing things that are misguided is important. However, what we find is that less often than doing that, moral individualists are just abandoning the field, right?
Yeah.
They don't volunteer, they don't show up at the institution. So they're not really calling it to account, they're just opting out of it. And that is dangerous for democracy, right? So
Hmm.
we need um, people who are willing to um, invest in institutions to improve them where they can. And there are lots of ways to do that, but you can't do it if you just never show up.
Yeah.
If you don't volunteer, if you don't take part in the activities of our social and political institutions.
That's interesting. I've read, so read your article. Read another civics related book recently, conducting another interview soon, and read another number of other things recently, where the takeaway is essentially that for things to get better, for there to be a fix, we need behavioral changes from a very large number of people. And that like, maybe while correct, is not something, I think, like, if you look at history, it's not something that comes out of nowhere. It's not like, I would say, like, for example, us getting on this trend towards a higher degree and higher intensity of moral individualism probably did not start with, a bunch of people just sitting around in the 70s and thinking, all things considered, like, I'm going to be more individualistic. It probably, there was probably some sort of catalyst. And thinking off the top of my head of, catalysts that push people the other way, the president is, looking at the history of presidential approval ratings, it's never so high as in the wake of an attack from a foreign body that, whether it's Al Qaeda or Iraq or whatever, that temporarily, it's always temporary, brings people together where all of a sudden Republicans are feeling true camaraderie with Democrats, and they have an external enemy to which they can orient, and where that kind of brings them towards each other. You kind of see a similar phenomenon, I think, in Canada right now, as their polling for their presidential race has completely changed to favor
Yeah.
the Liberal Party that's currently in charge, because all of a sudden they get to orient themselves towards opposing the policies of the United States under Donald Trump. Kind of went
Yeah.
all over with that, but basically, are there any? So you're looking at changes that you want from individuals, but are there systemic changes that you think could help facilitate that?
Well, I think one of the interesting points here, and we'll go back to something we talked about earlier, is in the wake of some sort of significant exogenous shock or external event or something like that, that would have the tendency to help people see themselves as part of some larger entity as opposed
Right.
to some sort of individual. For me, the question is, just extrapolating from our research, is will there be institutions available to actually
Yeah.
take advantage or you know make use of that moment?
Hmm.
Um, a lot of people may want to collectively rally together, but if nobody believes in any of the institutions, then where are they going to go? And if the institutions have atrophied, where are they going to go? And if civic engagement is a bit like an emotional muscle, if you haven't exercised it for years and years and years, how what result will that produce? I honestly don't know the answers to those questions, but
Yeah.
I think it demonstrates how difficult it will be to start thinking about what sorts of moral claims people might find persuasive and legitimate in these moments.
Yeah, I don't really have a great answer for what is going to fix this. What is going to lead to dramatic social change. I do think that at its heart, our book says that the ideas matter, right?
Yeah.
That how we think about ourselves, um, in relation to important influences and institutions in our lives really does matter. And we're certainly not arguing for the end of all autonomy. That's not what we want to see. But what we do want to see is a clearer recognition that institutions can have a productive role in shaping us, in influencing us, and we can invest in those institutions in ways that make them better. And so, what is going to lead to that? What is going to provoke that? Well, I think that's a gigantic question and it's a really hard question to answer. But how we talk about ourselves, how we think about ourselves in relation to others, um, and in relation to the forces that help to shape us is an important element of that process.
Hmm.
If the institutions are gone, if they're so damaged that we can't really invest in them at all, then that's certainly deeply, deeply problematic. I don't know that we're at that point yet. We are at a
Hmm.
point where we desperately need, it seems to me, people who are willing to be builders of institutions that work and that meet the needs of ordinary people in the United States. That that doesn't just come from burning it all down, you know. And I think increasingly over multiple election cycles, we have seen a meaningful percentage of Americans who simply want to do that. And
Yeah,
there's no real regard for the claims of our existing institutions or for their promise.
yeah. Well put. Well put. Well put. Let me ask each of you one final question before we go. This has been really a lot of fun, and I hope we do leave it in a hopeful place in the sense that change really does start with us, and if you invest in institutions in your community, participate, that those sorts of things do that they filter up. Might take time, but they do filter up, and when we're looking at uh, the lifespan of a nation, you can think about things in terms of the impact over generations, not just the impact over 5 months or whatever. But for each of you, and you can answer in whatever order you'd like, what makes you optimistic about the future?
What makes me optimistic about the future is that I really do believe that our system and our civic religion and theology teaches that uh, people are worth something, that each individual has human dignity, and that rights, liberties flow from the individual dignity that people have.
Hmm.
And it just takes a little more effort to remember that that dignity itself is grounded in something important and stable and durable if we just search for it.
Yeah, I love Kelly's answer. I think we actually do need a kind of um, renaissance of the recognition of human dignity, of the value of each of us, and that sort of approach um, is likely to be more than just you do you. You know, there is a recognition um, of our dependence on each other, but also of our of the goodness and the dignity of others. I mean, when I think about what makes me optimistic, I think a little bit about my mother, who's 80, almost 80 years old. And to me, she is the person who exemplifies this willingness to invest in the good of the community and in institutions um, that matter. And that those have been religious, they've been educational, they've been community institutions over
Hmm.
the years. You know, she told me a little while ago she's now on the board of the NAACP in my hometown, and I'm like, okay, that's
That's awesome.
awesome,
For
right?
for
And
er-
she help. She's not a black woman. She
yeah,
is
I was gonna say,
a middle class white woman who grew up in Salt Lake.
yeah.
But what leads her to do that is in fact exactly what Kelly said. It is a recognition of the worth and dignity and meaning of um, of other people, and a desire to build institutions that reflect that dignity and and offer opportunity. And so that to me is pretty inspiring. And it's not just, it is about sort of individual action, but it's a recognition of our connections to each other and our embeddedness in communities and institutions that can work collectively to make life better for everyone. And we need more of that and not less. And it seems like less and less people are willing to engage in those activities, but there are people who are, and those people make
Yeah.
me optimistic.
Yeah, we
That's a
need more of what you're doing, Nick.
Yeah.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Appreciate that. And hopefully, hopefully it works. Hopefully it works. Thank you. Thank you both very much. I think those were great answers. Your article on moral individualism is already out. Where was that published, actually? It was, personal privilege being friend of the family. I got it via email. But where was that? Where was that published?
That was published in a journal, an academic journal called Perspectives on Politics, and then our
Okay.
book will come out in the summer from Oxford University Press.
Oh, perfect. Nice. All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Kelly Patterson, Professor Chris Karpowitz. Every single time I stumble on it, I'm not sure why. Professor Chris Karpowitz of Brigham Young University. All right. And that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.